Have you ever wanted to make a quilt but didn't have a pattern? Well, being that school is back in session, let's tackle the sewing science of quilt making. I will show you today how to make your very own pattern if you know just one piece of math from that other quilt you're trying to follow. Let's get started. That is right, everybody. Welcome back to class and welcome back to Making It Fun. I am your host from Michael Miller Fabrics, Rob Appel, and I'm super excited to see you're all here. And if you're like me, you're lucky because your house just got really quiet because your kids have gone off to school and you are now back at home all by yourself loving your quilt making process. So you're going to get a lot done for the next few months because you have all this free time. Yeah, I know, I'm just dreaming. But I got to tell you this story before we get started, and we do have a lot of work to do today, so make sure you stick with me because not only am I going to break down this awesome quilt you see here, but I'm going to teach you how to draft your own patterns in case you ever get stuck with one of those situations where you've seen the perfect quilt to make, but you just can't find the pattern. And that's exactly what happened to me. Long story, and I know I'm long-winded and over-caffeinated, so I'll try to make it brief. But recently, we inherited a new-to-us couch from some friends. One of the reasons they were getting rid of it is the cool little reclinable footrest wouldn't close all the way. You know I love to fix stuff, so I crawled under the couch last week and to see if I could figure out what the problem was, and lo and behold, I found this quilt wedged in the back corner, keeping the apparatus from working correctly. So of course, I pulled it out, sent a photo over to my friend who gave us the couch and said, "Hey, do you recognize this awesome quilt?" And she says, "Yes, it's my mom's quilt and Granny made it for her. We need to get it back." So I said, before I give it back, can I teach all my friends at Making It Fun how to make this awesome quilt? And if you look at it real close, it's basically a bear paw variation, but that's exactly what I did. I pulled the quilt out from underneath the couch, dusted it off, and started pulling some measurements so that I could teach all of you how to make your very own pattern. So we will be using the wonderful STEM Squad fabric by Edward Miller for Michael Miller Fabrics. It's a super great science, STEM meaning science, math, technology, engineering. So it's a really, really fun fabric line. And of course, you'll be able to find this at your local quilt shops, your online retailers. So we're going to dive into the pattern construction in a minute, but I want to show you how I figured this out. So all we need to do is find one element in our project. So I'm going to take one of these elements, and even though, like I said, it's basically a variation of a bear paw block, it's not put together the same, and that's going to be one of the tricks when we get to the design wall here in a few moments. So what I did is I looked at it, and first you want to break down the construction of the quilt. How was it formed? How was it created? Yes, you see some flying geese here or some half square triangles. You see a bigger half square triangle if you look in here. You see this big square. Well, the first thing I noticed was this big square does not have a seam going through it. So I realized this big square is a very trustworthy piece of data for my quilting science. So I simply I took out a ruler. Oh, and by the way, we have Granny's permission to go ahead and break down this quilt today. She's very excited to be with us. So at any rate, so I looked at this square and it basically finished at all but 4 inches. So 4 inches for a square like this makes life super, super easy because it's going to allow me to divide the other pieces evenly. And so let's talk about that a little bit further. So we know now this is a 4-inch finished square, and if you're brand new to quilt making, let me explain what's going to happen. This finished square, something like this, needs to have some extra fabric all the way around it so we can sew the other fabrics to it. As a matter of fact, we all know, those of us who've made a quilt or two, we need a 1/4 inch on all 4 sides, so it actually equals a 1/2 inch larger when you're talking about squares. Now keep that in mind, we're just talking about squares right now. So I measured this square, I came up with 4 inches. So my cut squares, and yes, we're going to have some fun fussy cutting our little science guys today. These are going to be a 4.5 raw or 4.5 inch cut so that it finishes at 4 inches. That's quilt math, that's quilt science. Now, what I also want to point out real quick is there are a couple of half square triangle units in each section as well. So the nice thing is with this being a 4-inch finish, that means that these needed to finish at 2 inches. Well, this is where I need you to really pay attention. If you've never done triangle math for quilt making, instead of adding that 1/2 inch like I just did with my square, I'm actually just going to add 7/8 of an inch to my finished size that I want my block done. So if these are going to finish at 2 inches, because 2 plus 2 equals the 4 here, then I need these to be each starting at 2 7/8 versus 2 1/2, because we're dealing with a sewing along the diagonal, and that's going to consume a little bit more fabric and change our math a little bit. We won't get into the Pythagorean theorem today because I might not get my calculations just right, if you know what I'm saying. So that's what I did to figure out this quilt. It truly was that simple because, like I said, it's a square and then it's a bear paw variation featuring 1, 2, 3, 4 small half square triangles and then this larger half square triangle. Keeping in mind, this larger half square triangle like this here, right? That's going to finish also at 4 inches because that square is 4 inches. So this square has to be 4 inches, like these have to finish into 4 inches. So then in making this half square triangle unit here, I started with 4 7/8 squares of each of my 2 fabrics. Now let's break that down using the awesome Stem Squad fabric by Edward Miller for Michael Miller Fabrics. And yeah, no relation, but that's pretty fun, isn't it? Okay, so let me get myself organized real quick so I can teach the actual block making here. I just absolutely love this quilt, and it's wonderfully soft. It's been loved and washed many a times. So anyways, thank you, Granny, for letting us use your wonderful bear paw variation. I'll be right back. So I am back, and like I said, it's a bear paw variation because this here is the block we're going to truly make. This is truly a bear paw. So if you're brand new to quilting, again, welcome to Making It Fun. This is a great place for you to be hanging out. I will help you learn to quilt if you'll join me each Wednesday. But again, this was technically a square put in here, 1, 2, 3, 4 half square triangles, and then another solid square that was put in here. Now this solid square, when they all come together, starts to look like this square here, but that's one of the tricks that Granny did. She left us the ability to do some really fun fussy cutting and play a little bit different. So we, like I said, are going to assemble this quilt differently than either of these blocks, either the bear paw or the bear paw variation, are assembled. It's just going to look mostly like this when we're done. So that being said, let's dive into the construction of today's project, and I'll just repeat the math over and over again as we go through. Now I want to make half square triangles, and I'm going to feature my awesome, well, let's back up a little bit. You can probably see on the table, I'm using the black as my neutral. Actually 2 different fabrics though. I'm using my really cool science guys, right? I just love these. These are the ones I'm fussy cutting, and those are being fussy cut at the 4 1/2 inches because they're just the solid squares that fill in there. So I don't need that 7/8, just 4 1/2 for those. But then when I got into my cool little, what do we have? DNA, we've got some microscopes, we've got some beakers and some flasks and test tubes and things. So this particular is another, that's my background black that you see here. The work I'm doing here are strips that are cut either at 2 7/8 or 4 7/8. And of course I also did that for all of the colors that you'll need for your project. And for that, I'll just point this out really quick because I think it's super adorable. We have our girl scientists. We have our cool computer screen. We have our boy scientists, right? And then I absolutely love this print. You can see circuit board technology. Awesome! And then of course the rest of the line features the periodic table and some equations and some other great geometry. So just a fantastic line from Edward Miller, having a blast with it. Getting back into construction now, I'm going to be taking right sides together, a square of the black, and a square of any of my colors that I'm using. And I've already drawn a diagonal line across here. We're going to use that as a seam guide. So we're actually going to end up with 2 half square triangles that will look just like this, if I can get my hands on it there. Okay, so this is now finishing at 4 1/2. I started with 4 7/8 pieces, each of these squares here. So now let's just head on over to the sewing machine. We're going to do a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm doing a 1/4 inch on either side of this drawn line there. So just using that as my guide, I'm going to stitch down one side. I like to just lift the needle and rotate around if I can, and start sewing here on the other side. So you're doing 2 rows of sewing, one on either side. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use our ruler to keep our hands safe and our cutter, and we're just going to cut right along that drawn line, just like that. And let's just make it a habit today to be ironing to the dark side. So I'm going to hold my dark fabric up in the air. I'm going to press this over. And we'll do it quickly for both. And one of the things we talk about here at Making It Fun often is personal level of accuracy. So like I said, there's a lot of different skill sets in quilt making. A lot of us like our quilts to have somewhat sharp points when we're done, 90-degree squares, those kinds of things. So when you're making your half square triangles this way, it is encouraged to go ahead and trim them down. Now I will tell you that I did not trim any of these on the wall, because by using that 7/8 mark, they're coming out all but perfect. You could always round up an 1/8, and so instead of using 4 7/8, you're using 5 inches, or instead of 2 7/8, you're using 3 inches, but then you'll definitely need to trim them down. So let me show you how to trim them down regardless. Now one of the things I will always do is I'm going to go ahead and find a 45-degree angle on my ruler. And I'm going to lay that down, and I'm first looking to make sure that that lines up, and I am basically right on my 4.5 on this back corner. So right now I'm just going to do a little bit of a trim, and I like to go from the edge of the ruler off the corner, the middle of the ruler I should say, off to the corner. So just the slightest trim there. And that's why, because it was such a slight trim, I decided that I wasn't going to bother trimming mine down. They were all close enough. This is the important part. Diagonal again on that seam allowance. Now I'm really lining up my 4.5 and my 4.5 as I come across here, and I will take the time to trim that down. And again, a wise choice anytime you're making half square triangles. If you're using that 7/8 and an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance, they're coming out all but spot on nonetheless. So once you have your big triangles made up, you're just going to go ahead and build stacks. Like I said, trim them if you like. I won't stop you, but you're not getting extra credit in my class for that either. Now let's make some small ones. Same exact method. I will point out though, because I just got 2 half square triangles out of the big squares, if I use 4 of these small squares like this, I will now have enough for 2 complete units, right? So I'll have enough for this one here and enough for this one here if we're looking at the white fabric I'm using. So I'm just going to sew one of these together so you can see, but I wanted to point out, take all 4. Don't ask me why I'm pointing this out. Make sure your right sides together. Sometimes we get going a little quick and we forget to put our right sides together with this method. Right sides together, same exact sewing, 1/4 inch on either side of our little drawn line. Right through the edge there and back to the other side. And of course, if you're a chain piecer, if you like to do these assembly line style, you can most certainly do that as well. Like I said, all of those will need sewing over time, but let's just get to the layout on the wall here because it's pretty exciting the way it's done. Again, cutting on that line, pressing to the dark side constantly. And now I have those 2 half square triangles, and remember, they need to finish now down to 2.5 so that they can go back together to fill in and make that 4-inch square that matches up everything in this project. So before we bounce onto the design wall, I want to point this out. If you're doing this kind of work, even if the project you're trying to replicate didn't use even numbers, I suggest you do use even numbers. Like having that 4-inch square to start with made my life super easy. If it had been a 4.5, I would have still been adding 7/8 to that half, and then I would have been all over the board. So like a 4-inch or maybe a 6-inch would be another great size, because then you could have two 3-inch finished half square triangles, right? So then those would be 3 7/8, and you'd be cutting 6 7/8 for the big squares. You see how I'm doing that? It all just plays off of the 7/8 addition for your triangles and a 1/2-inch addition for your squares. Hopefully that's making sense. So now let's go ahead and break this down on the design wall. So remember when I said this is like a bear paw, but it's not assembled like the bear paw? That's because we want to be able to put in these awesome, right, little fussy cut science guys, or whatever you want to put in to your square. So in order to get this square to come back out, I did not assemble the original bear paw as you see with the half square triangles. As a matter of fact, here's the trick. The half square triangles go together themselves to form flying geese. Now these could be done as flying geese, but you wouldn't know what colors you wanted, because you'll notice on the wall it's a very random layout of color and squares. They're not all in the same spot. Okay, so let's go back to our table for a second and talk about how this is all going to go together. Right? So the easiest way to think about this is you're going to have a bear paw, and then you're going to have your squares, and sometimes my brain, my half square triangles struggles with which way to put these angles. So I've learned I want these angles facing here, because this is where we're going to be able to come in and put our square ever so nicely. So you're going to have 4 half square triangles, and now they face the same way on each side. Okay, so that forms that bear paw variation there. And you can see that I have my science sewer there in the center. And then from there, I'm just going to play with, and I kind of like pink and green in opposite sides. So again, I'm going to have a triangle facing in, and because it's a directional fabric, all of my science guys are standing upright there. I'm going to bring in my half square triangles to frame in my square. Those will just go in the same orientation, just like this. My eye sees these black background fabrics coming together to form the triangles, and that really helps me position what I need to position when I'm putting in the second pieces. So there, just looking for that triangle to form. And then we'll finish off here with the white in the corner. Oh, how to keep the rotation. There we go. So now you can see basically the layout we have, right? All of those represent my 1/4-inch seam allowances. This here would make an entire block. And one of the easy ways to put this project together is to make these blocks just like this over and over again, keeping one of your fussy cut center squares at 4.5 inches, upright, and just changing your positions of your colors, your green, your blue, your pink, and your white, which is how I basically did it on the wall. But while I was playing with this layout, preparing for all of you students today in class, what I really did is I just placed each section as I went along the design wall, and then I came over and I grabbed my half square triangle units, my flying geese to be, and I stitched them together and I put them right back on the wall so I would keep my orientation. So let me show you an easy trick for that as we're getting started here. So one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to sew my like colors together. So starting with these blues, I'm just going to fold them over just like this. And again, with a 1/4-inch seam allowance, and you might have already trimmed those dog-eared corners off. I've left mine. No real advantage or disadvantage there. And then I'm going to come over here and I'm just making sure I use the same seam location. And I'm just going to go ahead and take those. 1/4 inch seam allowance as well. Thread cut, and now what we're going to do is we're going to press these, but here's one of my tricks, is I'm going to press one kind of in the downhill fashion. So I'm just pressing into one square, and at that moment, the seam is heading that direction now at this union. So that means as I rotate this like this, I want to press the next seam in the up position so that my main seams, where there's a little bit more of a bulk now, where those triangles come together, are going to do what we call nesting. Okay, so now as I take this and I come here, you can probably see that those two triangles are heading in opposite directions. Okay, so when I flip this over like this, I can lock that together. I can lock my front edge together. I'm feeling that seam coming together. And now just again, another 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once the 4 half square triangle units are together, there's really no rhyme or reason of which way to press. So I'm just going to take a moment and get that nice and flat. But by having these units now built together, it's going to make my life so much easier. So I could actually come together and I could sew this entire grouping now into a row, build these, sew them into a row, and so on and so forth. So I could keep adding and building as I go. I've got some work to do to finish out my science style of Granny's quilt. This is probably 25% of the size of the quilt that I will finish making. So one of the things I did do is I made 1 4 7/8 inch strip of each of my colors. And you can see I haven't even used all of those when making my squares. And those squares were what were used for my big half square triangles. I also went ahead and cut one width of fabric, so 45 inches by the 2 7/8 of all of the fabrics. I have already cut now 5 though of my black fabric. I don't even know what I did with my black fabric. Anyways, it's missing. But of the black fabric, my background fabric, I've cut 5 strips so far. And so I will probably end up cutting roughly 20 of those strips to build out the rest of the quilt. I'll need to go back in and cut a few more of the 4 7/8 and probably another 3 more per each color of the 2 7/8 as well. I'm not sure how big I really want to build this, but I know all of you love to ask questions in those comments below, and that's one of the questions you'll be asking me is how much yardage do we really need? Well, we're not really making a quilt today, we're learning how to make our own quilts, right? So I'm going to leave the calculations up to you because your quilts will all grow uniquely into your own sizes. But right now, that's where I'm at. That's where I'm on the design wall. But if I listen really carefully, I think I just heard the recess bell ring. So I better sign off, let you all get back to work. I just wanted to share with you a moment how to calculate your own quilt pattern just using one small piece of math. Remember, add 1/2 inch to your squares and 7/8 to those triangles, knowing that you'll get 2 triangles for every one that we prepare with those squares the way we did it. So that'll put your calculations together. And what I really would love to know is if you like this style of video, number 1, and I would love to see your patterns and your versions of this quilt, so you could email me those pictures directly. You can't put them in the comments, but you can email me those pictures directly at rob@michaelmillerfabrics.com. We would love to see them. Maybe we can gather a bunch of fun photographs and put a little montage together for our social media or something great like that. Oh, that definitely was the recess bell. I gotta get going. We got another class starting at the end of the passing period. So we'll see you all next time right here at Making It Fun. Wow, you are still there. Thanks for sticking with me till the end of the video. I know, I get a little long-winded sometimes. But if you did enjoy today's video, make sure you check out a few of the other ones we've created. I think they're terrific. And of course, please subscribe to the channel. Make sure you hit the little bell to be notified. I don't want you to miss a moment of the fun. Stay safe and happy sewing.